Rain hit the windows of the 40th floor like static, and Ji-sung stood with his phone pressed to his ear, watching Seoul blur into a smear of red and gold 30 stories below. He'd been on the call with his mother for 6 minutes. 6 minutes of the usual careful nothing, wedding logistics, a caterer who'd fallen through, a question about whether he wanted his grandfather's ring reset or left as it was. Ordinary, forgettable. He said goodbye. She said goodbye. He didn't hang up first, because his mother never let a call end without being the one to end it. An old habit from a marriage that had trained her to always be the last one speaking, never the one abandoned mid-sentence. Except this time, she forgot. The line didn't go dead. It just changed rooms. He almost set the phone down. He would ask himself for weeks afterward what made him hold it to his ear one more second. A habit. A stray thought. The particular silence that comes right before someone says something they never meant for anyone to hear. And into that silence came his mother's voice again, quieter now, aimed at someone else. "Alana, you need to leave my son, before the wedding." Ji-sung's hand went still against the window. He heard Alana's voice, sharp with confusion. "What? Yura, what are you—" cut off by his mother, who did not raise her voice, who never raised her voice, and somehow that made it worse. "If you marry him, the people who destroyed your mother will come looking for you." The city kept moving underneath him, indifferent, wet, glittering. Ji-sung didn't move at all. "Your mother didn't abandon you, Alana." His mother's voice cracked on the word abandon, cracked in a way he had not heard since he was 9 years old, and hiding at the top of the stairs during a fight he wasn't supposed to witness. "I was there, the night she disappeared. I was there." A long pause. He could hear Alana breathing on the other end, uneven, like she'd been hit somewhere soft. "Your mother was trying to protect you, from Ji-sung's father." Ji-sung's reflection in the glass didn't look like a man who ran 4 companies and could silence a room with 2 words. It looked like a boy. And if Ji-sung finds out what his father did— A pause long enough that he thought, hoped, the call might finally have ended. Then, "He'll come after you himself." The line went dead. This time on purpose. His mother's thumb, somewhere across the city, finally finding the red button she should have found 6 minutes ago. Ji-sung stood very still, phone still raised, rain still falling, and understood that the life he thought he'd built, controlled, deliberate, entirely his own, had just been revealed to have a foundation he'd never once been shown. Before we go further into what Ji-sung did with what he'd just heard, welcome to Afro-Korean Story World. Every story here is written fresh for this channel, never recycled, never AI templated off someone else's plot. Tonight's story sits right in that place where love and inheritance collide, where the people who raised us keep secrets they call protection, and where the truth always finds a way to surface, usually at the worst possible moment. If tonight's episode grabs you, take a second and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and while you're here, drop your city and what time it is where you're watching. I like knowing who's in the room with me for these. Now, back to Ji-sung, standing at a window 40 floors above Seoul, holding a phone that had just detonated everything he thought he knew. He didn't call his mother back. He didn't call Alana either, though his thumb hovered over her name for a long, useless minute. What he did instead was pour himself a glass of water he never drank and sit down at his desk, like a man conducting a board meeting with no one else in the room, because that was the only posture his body knew how to take when the ground moved. "Your mother didn't abandon you." That sentence alone would have been enough to unmake him slowly, over weeks, but underneath it sat a second sentence, uglier, aimed at his own chest. "He'll come after you himself." His mother believed, actually believed, that if Ji-sung learned the truth about his father, he would become exactly the kind of man his father had been, dangerous to the woman he loved. He thought of every time his father had told him, "Love is a door you leave open for someone to walk through and take everything." He thought he'd rejected that lesson the day he met Alana in a rain-soaked bookstore in Itaewon 3 years ago, the day she'd told him, unprompted, that his cufflinks were trying too hard. He thought he'd already won that argument with his father's ghost. His mother didn't think so, and that terrified him more than anything else in the call. He didn't confront her that night. He told himself it was strategy, that if he showed his hand too early, he'd never learn the rest. The truer reason was smaller and more human. He was afraid of what his mother might say if he asked her directly, and afraid of what he might do with the answer. So he did what he always did with fear. He turned it into work. Alana didn't sleep that night either, 3 neighborhoods away in the small apartment above a bakery that she refused to let Ji-sung upgrade for her, no matter how many times he offered. She sat on her floor with her back against the bed, replaying Yura's voice on a loop that wouldn't quiet. She had spent 2 years being cold-shouldered by that woman. 2 years of clipped greetings, canceled tea meetings, a wedding date that kept mysteriously needing to be reconsidered. Alana had built a whole private mythology around it. Yura didn't want her son marrying a Black American woman, didn't want grandchildren who wouldn't look like the family photographs, didn't think Alana belonged inside the particular kind of quiet that old Korean money required. She'd made peace with that story. It hurt, but it made sense, and Alana had learned a long time ago that the stories that make sense are the ones you can survive. Tonight's phone call didn't make sense. Yura hadn't sounded cold. She'd sounded afraid, and underneath the fear, something that had cracked open and sounded almost like grief. "I was there the night your mother disappeared." Alana pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, like she could physically hold herself together. She had been 6 years old when her mother left. The story she'd grown up with, the story her grandmother told her in a kitchen in Atlanta, gentle but final, was that her mother had gone back to Korea for work and simply never returned. No calls, no letters. A woman who had chosen something over her daughter and never explained what. Alana had spent 21 years turning that absence into a scar she could live inside of. She told herself she didn't care. She told herself so often that most days it was almost true. But there was a smaller, younger voice underneath all of it that had never stopped asking the same 6 words. Why wasn't I enough? And now a woman who barely tolerated her was telling her, casually, in the middle of trying to talk her out of a wedding, that the story Alana had built her whole adult life around might not be true at all. She didn't call Ji-sung either, not that night. She needed, first, to figure out if she could trust her own hearing. 2 days passed in a fragile kind of normal. Ji-sung came to see her at the bakery apartment, brought the ridiculous croissants from the place she loved that always sold out by 9, and sat across from her at the small table, like a man pretending the floor beneath him hadn't shifted. He didn't tell her what he'd heard. He told himself it was to protect her until he knew more. The truth was closer to fear again. If he said the words out loud, they would become real in a way they weren't yet, sitting silent in his chest. Instead, he asked, carefully, watching her face the way he watched every face across a negotiating table. "Do you remember anything about your mother being in Korea before she left?" Alana went still in a way he recognized, because he'd done the same thing at his window 2 nights before. "Why are you asking me that?" It wasn't a question, it was a wall. "I want to understand you better," he said, which was true, and also not the whole truth, and she heard both halves of it. "There's nothing to understand. She left. Nobody ever told me why. The official story is she went back to Korea for work and never came home." Alana's jaw tightened. "I never believed that story, for what it's worth. It never made sense that a woman who braided my hair every Sunday night just stopped existing to me. But believing something's a lie and knowing the truth are 2 different things, and I gave up chasing the second one a long time ago." Ji-sung looked at her. Really looked, the way he rarely let himself, because looking too long at Alana always threatened to undo the careful architecture he'd built of himself. "What if I told you I might be able to find out?" he said quietly. Something moved across her face. Hope, guarded instantly, like a hand closing over a flame before it could be seen. "Then I'd ask you why you're suddenly so interested in a woman you've never met." He didn't have an answer he was ready to give her. Not yet. So he said nothing, and reached across the table instead, and covered her hand with his, and for once she let the silence sit there unchallenged, because some part of her had already started to suspect that the answer, whatever it was, wasn't going to be small. Kang Holdings kept two sets of history. One lived in the glass tower, all shareholder reports and press releases about clean energy investments, and hospital wings with the Kang name over the door. The other lived in a locked cabinet in the sub-basement archive that only 3 people had access to: Ji-sung's late father, Chairman Han, and, as of that week, Ji-sung himself, who used a set of override credentials he technically wasn't supposed to have and told himself he'd earned the right to anyway. What he found wasn't a smoking gun. It was worse. It was a silence, deliberately built. Financial records from 22 years ago that referenced Project Hana without ever explaining what Hana was. His mother's name appeared as a witness signature on 3 separate documents she should have had no business witnessing. His father's name appeared everywhere, thick and confident, a man who'd never once imagined anyone would go looking. And every record that should have named the woman at the center of it, every payroll entry, every internal memo, every visitor log, had a gap exactly where her name should have been. Not redacted, removed. Someone had gone back through history with a scalpel. That kind of erasure doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone was protecting a person, or destroying one, and Ji-sung didn't yet know which. Then, tucked in an unmarked folder behind a stack of unrelated tax filings, he found a photograph. His father, younger, dark-haired, unsmiling in the particular way that had always made servants flinch. Beside him, his mother, barely 30, already wearing the pearls she never took off now, and beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, a young black woman with a wide, easy smile that looked entirely unafraid of the 2 people flanking her. Ji-sung sat with that photograph for a long time. He had grown up believing his mother's coldness toward Alana was about disapproval. Looking at this photograph, he understood, with a lurch in his stomach, that it might be about memory instead. He didn't confront her right away. His mother was a woman who had spent 30 years learning how to survive being underestimated, and Ji-sung had learned from her, whether he wanted to admit it or not, that the person who asks the question first rarely controls the answer. So instead he waited, and 2 days later, his mother did something she had not done in years. She asked to see Alana alone. They met in the small tea room at the back of the Seongbuk-dong house, the one with the low table and the window that looked out on a persimmon tree Yura had planted the year Ji-sung was born. Yura poured tea with hands that Alana noticed, for the first time, were not entirely steady. "Your mother worked for my husband," Yura said, without preamble, without apology for the 2 years of cold silence that had come before this moment. "I won't tell you exactly what kind of work. Not yet. But I will tell you this." She set the teapot down with the particular care of a woman handling something that might shatter. "Your mother saved my son's life." Alana's cup stopped halfway to her mouth. "Ji-sung?" Yura nodded once. "How?" "I can't tell you that yet either." Yura's eyes lifted, and for the first time in 2 years, Alana saw something in them that wasn't coldness. It was exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a weight so long they've forgotten what their spine feels like without it. "What I can tell you is that your mother did not abandon you. She left because she believed someone was watching you, and she thought disappearing was the only way to keep you alive." The tea room went very quiet. "She didn't choose something else over me," Alana said. And it wasn't quite a question, because some part of her already knew, had maybe always known, in the place beneath conscious thought where 6-year-olds keep the truths they aren't ready to look at directly. "No," Yura said. "She chose your life, over her own." Alana put the cup down because her hand had started to shake too badly to hold it. 21 years of a story she'd built her whole adult identity around. "I don't need anyone. I don't need my mother. People leave and you survive it." Cracked straight down the middle in a tea room she'd never been invited into before that afternoon. She didn't cry immediately. First there was a strange, disorienting anger, at the years lost, at the grandmother who never knew the truth either, at the entire architecture of her own self-protection that she now had to look at differently. Then the anger gave way, and she put her face in her hands, and Yura, cold, controlled, untouchable Yura, reached across the low table and rested a hand on her back, and neither of them said anything for a long time. because there wasn't anything small enough to say. It was Yura who broke the silence, finally, with the sentence that would change the shape of everything that came after. "She's alive, Alana." Alana's head came up so fast she nearly knocked over the teapot. "I've known where she is for years," Yura said, and her voice, for the first time, trembled all the way through. "I've made sure she had what she needed, from a distance. It was the only way I could." She stopped, started again. "It was the only thing I could do." Alana wasn't crying anymore. She'd gone somewhere past crying, into a flat, stunned quiet. "If she's alive," she said slowly, "why didn't she come for me?" "Because every time she tried." Yura's hand found her pearls, that small unconscious gesture Alana had noticed before and never understood. "Someone from my husband's organization found her. Every time. For years." The persimmon tree outside the window moved in a wind neither of them noticed. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour with a sound like a small bell, and Alana sat with the knowledge that her mother had spent 2 decades being hunted for loving her too much to come home. Ji-sung came to her that night, and this time he told her everything: the phone call, the 2 days of silence, the photograph, the erased records. He'd meant to lead with an apology for keeping it from her. Instead, she got there first. "You knew," she said, standing in the doorway of her apartment, not letting him in yet. "For days, you knew, and you asked me about my mother, like you were fishing, like I was a source." "I was afraid," he said, and it cost him something to say it plainly, the way it always did. "If I told you before I understood what we were dealing with, I was afraid you'd disappear the same way she did. That you'd run before I could protect you from whatever this is. That's not your decision to make." Her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the specific fury of someone who has spent her whole life being managed by people who claim to love her. "You don't get to decide what I can handle." He didn't argue. He'd expected to have to argue, had rehearsed 3 different versions of a defense on the elevator ride over, and instead he found himself simply saying, "I know." She waited for the rest, the explanation, the justification. It didn't come. "That's it? I know?" "That's what scares me," he said quietly, "that I did the thing my father would have done. Decide what you needed to know, and when. I told myself it was different, because I meant it kindly, but I don't know that intention changes what it costs you." Something in her chest loosened, just slightly. Not forgiveness yet, but the beginning of a path toward it. She stepped back from the door, which was its own kind of answer, and he came inside, and they sat on her small couch not touching for a long moment before her hand found his. "If the truth proves your father hurt my mother," she said finally, testing him, "what then?" "Then I find out why." "All of it? Even if it destroys your family?" He looked at her, and something in his face went very still and very certain, the same stillness she'd fallen in love with 3 years ago in a bookstore, mistaking it then for arrogance, and understanding now that it was conviction. "You're my family," he said. "Whatever's left after the truth comes out, that's what I'm protecting, not the name on the building." The watching started 3 days later. It began small enough that Alana almost talked herself out of it. A message on an app she didn't recognize, no text, just a single photograph of her walking to work that morning, sent from a number that didn't exist when she tried to call it back. Then, worse. She came home to find her apartment door unlocked. Nothing taken, nothing disturbed except a drawer that had been closed when she left, and was open when she returned. 2 days after that, an old photograph appeared slid under her door. Her mother, young, laughing, standing in front of a shop Alana didn't recognize. No note, no explanation, just the photograph itself, like a threat dressed as a memory. And then the car. Gray, unremarkable, parked across from the school where she taught, there when she arrived, still there 4 hours later when she left, gone by the time Ji-sung's driver came to check. "Someone knows we're investigating," Ji-sung said, standing in her kitchen with a stillness that had gone dangerous, the kind of quiet she'd learned to recognize as more alarming than shouting. "And they want us to stop." He assumed, at first, that it traced back to his mother, that Yura, panicking, had escalated her warnings into something more active. He was wrong. and the wrongness of that assumption cost him 3 days he would later wish he'd had back. What he discovered instead, going back through the archive with a colder eye, was that someone inside his own organization had been quietly monitoring Alana for months, long before the phone call, long before any of them knew there was a secret worth guarding. His mother, it turned out, hadn't been the threat at all. She'd been running her own quiet counter-operation for years, moving money, redirecting information, keeping watchers off Alana's trail without ever telling her son she was doing it, because telling him would have meant telling him everything, and she still wasn't ready for that. The real threat wore a familiar, trusted face. Chairman Han, his father's oldest advisor, the man who'd stood beside Ji-sung at the funeral and called him son in the way men do when they mean to inherit influence, not affection. Han knew everything, and Han, it turned out, had reasons of his own for wanting the truth to stay buried, reasons that went far beyond loyalty to a dead man. The full shape of it came out in pieces, the way real truths usually do, not in one dramatic confession, but in fragments Ji-sung had to assemble himself, from surviving members of his father's old circle, men who'd rather talk to the son than face what the father might have left behind in writing. Alana's mother, her name was Nkechi, though the records had erased even that, had worked as a financial analyst inside one of the Kang family's legitimate businesses more than 2 decades ago. She was sharp, meticulous, and unafraid, 3 qualities that eventually led her to discover that Ji-sung's father had been using the company's clean books to quietly blackmail rivals and officials, laundering leverage instead of money. She found the evidence. She meant to expose it. Ji-sung's father decided, instead, to silence her. But silencing wasn't originally supposed to mean disappearance. It was supposed to mean discrediting. A manufactured story, painting her as the one who'd stolen from the company, a woman who couldn't be trusted, whose word wouldn't survive a courtroom or a headline. It very nearly worked. It would have ended her, professionally and personally, in a country far from home, with no family to vouch for her. Yura intervened. Quietly, at enormous personal risk, she helped Nkechi disappear before the false story could finish destroying her, got her out of Seoul, got her false documents, got her enough distance to survive. But Nkechi, refusing to simply vanish and let the lie stand unchallenged forever, made one copy of the original evidence before she left. She hid it somewhere she believed no one would think to look. She hid it with her daughter. The pendant had hung around Alana's neck since she was 6 years old. A small, unremarkable gold locket her mother had fastened there the night before she disappeared, the last thing Nkechi's hands ever did for her daughter that Alana could remember clearly. Alana had always assumed it was sentiment, a mother's goodbye gift. She'd worn it through braces and breakups and a master's degree and a move across the world, never once opening the tiny compartment at its back because it had always seemed sealed, decorative, done. It wasn't decorative. Inside it, smaller than a fingernail, sat a storage chip that had survived 21 years against Alana's collarbone. Financial records, internal memos, the original unaltered ledger Nkechi had found. Everything. Alana had been carrying the truth her entire adult life without knowing it, not protected by anyone else's vigilance, protected by her own body, by a mother's foresight, by a piece of jewelry no one had ever thought twice about. When Ji-sung realized what the pendant might contain, standing in Alana's kitchen with his hands very still at his sides, he didn't reach for it. He looked at her and let her be the one to decide whether to open it, because for the first time in this entire unraveling, he understood that this particular truth didn't belong to him to claim. Ji-sung confronted the last of his father's surviving inner circle in a private room above a restaurant in Gangnam that his father had once used for exactly this kind of conversation, and the irony wasn't lost on him. What he learned there was worse than blackmail. His father hadn't simply wanted Nkechi silenced. He'd needed a story that made her look guilty enough that no one would ever look for the truth behind her. So he built one, brick by careful brick, and let it outlive her disappearance for over 2 decades. A woman's entire reputation sacrificed to protect a lie. Ji-sung sat with that for a long time in the emptied room, the city's noise thin and distant through the windows. His father hadn't only destroyed one woman's chance at a life, he'd destroyed his own son's chance to ever know the truth about the person who had once saved him. Because Ji-sung remembered now, a memory he'd buried so deep, he'd nearly convinced himself it belonged to someone else. He was 15, furious, having just discovered something about his father's business that no 15-year-old should have to carry, ready to confront him, to do something reckless and irreversible in the particular righteous fury of a teenager who still believes the truth alone can fix things. A woman had stopped him in the hallway outside his father's study, kind-eyed, steady-voiced, a stranger he'd never learned the name of, and had spent years assuming he'd simply forgotten. "Whatever your father becomes," she'd told him, crouching slightly to meet his eyes, "you don't have to become him." He'd forgotten her face. He'd never once forgotten those words. They'd sat inside him for 14 years, quietly steering every decision he'd ever made to be different from the man who raised him, and he had never known, until this exact moment, sitting alone above a restaurant with his father's ghosts, that the woman who planted that sentence in him was Nkechi, Alana's mother, the first person who had ever tried to save him from his father's world, years before he'd even met her daughter. The final piece belonged to Chairman Han, and it reframed everything Ji-sung thought he understood about his father's guilt. His father had been ruthless. His father had been guilty of exactly what the records showed, but his father had also, for years, been managed, carefully, patiently, by the one man he trusted enough not to watch his own back around. Han had been quietly consolidating influence inside the organization for over a decade, using Ji-sung's father as both a weapon and eventually a liability he intended to remove once the timing suited him. Nkechi's evidence, if it ever surfaced, wouldn't only have exposed a dead man. It would have exposed Han, his fingerprints threaded through the same ledgers, the same blackmail scheme, the same instructions to bury a woman's name and reputation. That was the real reason the watching never stopped, even years after Ji-sung's father died. Han needed the evidence to stay buried far more than a dead man's reputation ever did. It wasn't the generic ending Ji-sung had braced for, dead father, sole villain, simple grief. It was messier and more human than that. A son discovering that even his father's worst sins had been, in part, someone else's design, which didn't excuse the guilt, but complicated the mourning in a way Ji-sung hadn't been prepared for. Yura finally brought Alana to her mother on a gray Tuesday, down a set of narrow stairs behind an unmarked door in a basement 3 streets off the main road in Itaewon, where a small hand-lettered sign in English and Korean read only, "Braids, appointment only." Alana had walked past that block a dozen times without ever knowing. The room smelled like shea butter and hot comb steam, and something floral underneath it that Alana couldn't name but felt in her chest, before she understood why. A woman stood at the back, older than the photographs, hair threaded with gray now, hands steady around a client's half-finished cornrows. She looked up. The comb stopped moving. "Alana?" Alana didn't run to her. She'd imagined this reunion 1,000 ways across 21 years, and none of the imagined versions had prepared her for how her body actually reacted. Rooted to the floor, chest tight, the specific paralysis of wanting something so badly for so long that finally standing in front of it feels unreal. "Why didn't you come back?" Alana said, and it wasn't gentle, because it wasn't supposed to be. 21 years of unasked questions don't arrive gently. Her mother's face crumpled, and the client in the chair quietly, tactfully, gathered her things and let herself out, and Nkechi came around the chair with hands that hovered, uncertain whether they were allowed to touch her daughter yet. "I tried," she said, 3 times. Every time, they found me first. The 3rd time, I understood. If I kept trying, I wasn't going to save you. I was going to get you killed trying to reach me." Her voice broke fully now. "Staying away was the only thing I could do that actually protected you. It was the worst decision I ever made, and the only right one, and I have hated both those things being true every single day since." Alana felt the old scar crack the rest of the way open, not painfully this time, but like something finally allowed to heal correctly instead of around a wound left untreated. She closed the last few feet of distance herself and her mother's arms came around her the way they had when Alana was 6, like no time had passed at all in the part of the body that remembers being held. It wasn't just a reunion. It was Alana finally setting down a story she'd been carrying since childhood. People leave because I'm not enough to stay for, and picking up the truer, harder, more generous one instead. Chairman Han made his offer to Ji-sung 3 days later, in the same 40th floor office where this entire story had begun, standing at the same window Ji-sung had once stood at, holding a phone he hadn't meant to keep listening to. Keep the empire, keep Alana safe. Han was careful to make that sound like a genuine promise, and not the threat it actually was. Forget the past. Let a dead man's sins stay buried with him. Ji-sung didn't answer immediately. He let the silence sit the way his mother always had, and understood, finally, that he'd inherited that particular weapon from her, not from his father. "No," he said, eventually. Han's expression didn't change, not at first. "You understand what you're choosing to destroy. I understand what I'd be choosing to become, if I said yes." Ji-sung turned from the window. "My father built this on other people's silence. If I protect it the same way, I'm not different from him. I'm just younger." It wasn't a choice between love and power. In the end, the way Han had clearly hoped to frame it. It was simpler and more final than that. A choice about which version of himself Ji-sung was willing to spend the rest of his life being. The evidence came forward all at once, 3 weeks later, at his father's memorial rite, Han's own choice of venue, ironically, insisting the family gather to honor the dead properly, unaware that the occasion would become the very place his sins surfaced. Ji-sung stood before the assembled family and old business partners with the original ledger from Alana's pendant, his mother's written testimony, and the records he'd pulled from the sub-basement archive, and he laid all of it on the table where the memorial offering sat, because he could think of no more honest place to put the truth than beside the food meant to honor a man's memory. His mother stood beside him. When the room turned to her, disbelieving, furious, some of them already reaching for phones and lawyers, Yura didn't flinch and didn't soften it. "I knew," she said, simply. "I helped hide a woman's name for over 20 years to keep her alive. I would do it again, but I should have told my son the truth long before he had to overhear it by accident, and that failure is mine to carry, not his." It cost her exactly what she expected it to cost her. Within the month, the Foundation's board, the one clean, careful thing she'd built entirely on her own, separate from her husband's name, quietly removed her from the chairmanship she'd held for 15 years, citing reputational concerns. She didn't fight it. She'd spent 30 years learning which battles were worth the cost, and this one, she told Ji-sung later, she'd already decided to lose the moment she picked up the ledger and carried it into that room. Han's exposure took longer and cost more, and involved lawyers Ji-sung hadn't wanted to need. But it happened. The organization his father built on leverage and silence didn't survive the unraveling intact, and Ji-sung, methodically, over the following months, dismantled every part of it that had ever depended on someone else's fear. Alana found him afterward on the roof of the building where this had all begun. Rain again, though lighter this time, more mist than storm. "I love you," she said, standing close enough that he could feel the warmth off her skin against the cold air. "But loving you doesn't erase what your family did." "I don't want it to erase anything," he said. "I don't want you to forget any of it. I just want the chance to spend the rest of my life proving that loving you was the first thing my family ever actually did right." She looked at him a long moment, rain gathering in her lashes, and something in her chest, the old fortress she'd built brick by brick since she was 6 years old. People leave, don't need anyone, protect yourself first. Finally, fully, came down. "Then stand beside me," she said. "Not in front of me. I don't need you fighting the whole world on my behalf. I need you next to me while I fight my own share of it." He took her hand instead of pulling her behind him, which was its own quiet, enormous kind of vow. Months later, the wedding was small, smaller than anyone in Kang Holdings' old circle would have expected, or approved of. No display, no entourage of men whose loyalty had always run toward whoever held the most fear over them. Just family, and the handful of people who'd earned the right to be called that honestly. Nkechi did Alana's hair herself the morning of, in the same unhurried way she once had on childhood Sunday nights, humming something under her breath that Alana half remembered from a kitchen in Atlanta 22 years ago. Before Alana walked toward Ji-sung, Yura took her hand at the edge of the aisle. No pearls today, Alana noticed. The necklace finally returned weeks earlier to the woman it had always belonged to, and said, quietly, just for her, "Your mother should have been standing here all those years you needed her. I can't give you those years back." A pause. "But let me stand beside you now." Alana cried, finally. Not from grief this time, but from the specific fullness of having, at last, more family than she knew what to do with. Yura took her hand, and Nkechi took the other, and the three of them walked the last few steps together. Ji-sung watched them come toward him and understood, for the first time in 29 years, that he wasn't standing there as the heir to anything. He was just a man, waiting for the woman he loved, with nothing left to protect her from, and nothing left to hide. That's where we'll leave them. Not with an empire, not with a secret, just two people who fought their way to honesty and decided that was worth more than everything they'd have kept by staying quiet. I wrote this one thinking about how often the people who love us hardest are the ones most tempted to lie to protect us, and how rarely that actually works the way they hope. Do you think Yura made the right call, all those years, choosing silence over the truth? Would you have forgiven her as quickly as Alana did, or would you have needed more? And if you were in Ji-sung's place, would you have chosen the truth even knowing what it would cost your own family's name? Let me know where you land in the comments. If stories like this one, cross-cultural, messy, honest about love and inheritance both, are the kind of thing you want more of, go ahead and subscribe, because there's another one of these coming soon.